Alright, we're back with more college football coverage, and in this one, we do in fact have an update on the overall Sherrone Moore trial. But before getting into that aspect of it, we need to take it back because it has been a while since I've covered it on here extensively. But I was aware with some of the last videos that there was a court date for January 22nd scheduled for the first portion of this trial, the beginning phase. And let's just say in that one, there wasn't a whole lot that happened, which does make sense the way it looks like from an outsider's perspective. Obviously, I'm not any kind of person involved in any legal matters or things like that, so I'm not going to have a full-on understanding of how every intricacy of that may work. But again, unless you have all your ducks in a row, if you have evidence perfectly corroborating with every single detail before you even enter the courtroom, maybe there's a chance you can get it out of the way quickly. But that's obviously not how things work most of the time. Because even in those cases, there are other nuances and other minor details that might not always get brought up that could then be posed in a court of law. And it could throw a wrench in the game plan for either the plaintiff side, for the defendant side, wherever you want to look at for that, right? That's kind of what we did end up devolving into. But for the court case in January, on January 22nd, the main thing that stemmed from that, honestly, was the fact that for some reason, they believed Morrison and his lawyer essentially believed that the entire case should be thrown out on their end. Feed you a quote from Fox 2. This particular article, I think this is based in, this is based in Detroit. So from them, as we get towards the end of the article, this quote states, "Last month, Moore's probable cause conference was rescheduled as both the prosecution and defense sought more evidence in the case, including phone records and Title IX documents. That same day, Moore's attorney, Ellen Michaels, said she had filed a motion to quash the arrest warrant and dismiss the complaint. Michaels also said the arrest warrant was issued based on false, misleading statements presented as fact and that a Franks hearing was requested." End quote. Now, as far as the context of this video goes, I want you to hang on to the first piece of that quote for the rest of the video. If both the prosecution and the defense are seeking more evidence in this case, clearly neither of them are taking everything at face value from all that we heard about in the original police report, all that we heard in the original arrest, in all of the different buzz surrounding that, not to mention all the other BS scattering all over the place on the internet in regards to how many other women he was allegedly involved in having conversations with and things like that. Again, I'm not delving into any of that because, again, even if that is true, it's like that is not much of anything to do with what is going on in this particular case. It's somewhat, if true, it paints a little bit of a picture, but it's not relevant to the details in this one. It just isn't. So I'm not even about to spend any time on that. But phone records, that's fair. I mean, you only had a select few text messages, and admittedly, with the contents of some of those text messages, they painted a very dark picture. When you have the man constantly texting this person's phone and leading up to the alleged incident in question, doing the same thing without much of a response before the victim in this situation tried to, again, get out of town for, again, with what I said at the time, my belief is that she was simply trying to get out of town to get out of range for Moore to possibly confront her in honestly any manner. You can't necessarily assume that Moore was always going to have that kind of approach to handling the situation, even if what was detailed in the press reports leading up to this painted out to be pretty fucking deranged, to say the least. There's just no way to guarantee that, right? But if this were a situation where the victim was truly fearing for her safety, then it's like, okay, maybe a restraining order in this situation is not going to be enough. I need to try to find a completely different location that he has no knowledge of whatsoever, so that he doesn't try to come and find me there. And, you know, at least even then, if I'm there, maybe I could consider following a restraining order in that situation as well. Just trying to get out of his way, basically, in his potential wrath, if, again, we're dealing with that specific tone of the reporting here. Like, it was like those quotes, man. You hear something like that, and you hear about him potentially willing to cause self-harm to himself or threatening to commit to that, just to, you know, have a conversation with this woman or prevent her from being able to move forward. It's like, that is a pretty dangerous situation to be in. And again, when that came out, it just got completely twisted. Believe me, it was one of the first to say, okay, like this is a turn out of absolute left field. But maybe if they find more evidence on these phones, the whole narrative around that could shift. And then Title IX documents as well are important. Now, again, if you're making the initial arrest, it is what it is. But of course, it's going to be incomplete. States are going to have their own methods of attacking anything that has to deal with potential domestic abuse, domestic violence, and things of that nature. However, Title IX, obviously, is federal. And we have to go all the way back for Title IX in that sense, because understandably so, Title IX, the law itself, came out in 1972. So we're talking about a few years, still within the realm of the civil rights era, but of course in a time where women were still subject to these kinds of behaviors and these kinds of incidents without pretty much any repercussions whatsoever on the larger scale. That is why the law was enforced in the first place. And it is in the overall government on them as well to enforce it. Every single school, especially from the standpoint of college and university, is going to have some form of written documentation relating to that law and relating to, again, establishing it in the first place on that particular premise, and then also outlining any potential consequences that may come along with violating Title IX. In this case, they'd probably be looking for Michigan's statement on Title IX. They'd probably be looking for past examples of how they've enforced it on their campus in other situations in which they probably should have. Maybe chose to, maybe chose not to. Now again, with Michigan, the more case, if it stands to be true, and even with it not being true, the scandal's already done so much damage. And again, it isn't even the first one in the past decade, the past 5 years, that they've had to deal with relating to employer-employee relationships on their campus. And that in and of itself is why Jenner & Block, the law firm, is still actively investigating the university as a whole. Not just Sherrone Moore, but also Ward Manuel, other members of the university, for that specific reasoning right there. And that fact was also outlined by another source here as I was reading on. So you have all that going down. We just genuinely are looking for more context here. If this is meant to be a civil case, you're still going to have to deal with a lot more than just the initial police report. All it can do is give you a baseline to maybe springboard from in the future. The arrest, whether it's legitimate or not, at least an initial one I should say, is not going to be enough to convict unless you have hard evidence. As I was saying earlier, like it has to be right on the money. And the accuracy rate, it isn't always going to fall that way. That's just not how this thing works. But it made things interesting for more. And as a different quote, see if I can find it. Yeah. Well, I guess that also correlates with the second part of the one from Fox too. So I don't need to necessarily state this one from the Detroit Free Press, another Michigan-based source, which makes sense if this is happening there. I just want to be fair about, how I go about trying to get this information, right? But the second part of the quote, where Michaels is honestly doing her job, we can come at different lawyers for saying this stuff, especially in cases where we have a clear idea that something is definitely true or false, and yet they'll still go out on the limb to make a statement that just doesn't make any sense to us. Michaels, at the end of the day, is doing her job by claiming that these things are false and just opinions and misleading statements. She's got to defend her client. You can understand that from that standpoint. But unfortunately, for situations like this, not even just on a celebrity level, because obviously you're going to have that in the headlines more, stuff like this can typically happen more often than you think. I mean, hell, you see it online right now with different posts going around of just absolutely false information that people run with. You'll see it on different videos trying to detail information perceived to be fact, and it turns out to be completely false. People are literally making money off of presenting misleading statements as fact. So it's not something that can be out of the realm of possibility. There have been a number of cases, I should say, over the years where you've had people be in situations where they're, cast as the suspect in a case, and it turns out that whether it be in the courts initially, before they are sentenced to jail time, or even when you get to them potentially being in jail, serving time in prison for a number of years, and then having their case revisited after, again, all that time away from those you love, away from society as a whole. Can't even really get into your normal routine anymore. That's when, in some cases, there have been discrepancies found that have gotten some people freed and released from prison. And then there are others, in the more extreme cases, of course, when you deal with death row and stuff like that, some people will be placed there, have their case revisited when it's too late, to then have the information come out that they should not have been jailed in the first place. But of course, with how some of these states work, the execution laws there and policies still go through for that particular person, and again, it ends up being too late off of misleading statements, off of bias, off of things like that. Now again, this case compared to anything relating to, like, this isn't going to be a death row thing, so I don't bring that up to, be so extreme about it, but it's like, this can happen, and it has before. The only thing is, with bringing this up again, is it that the victim in this case has absolutely no ground to stand on at all? That is what the jury in this case, as they continue to go to all these hearings and things like that, are they going to take it as such? Even if the lawyer can say that, it's not like you can completely discredit the victim in this case either, alleged victim, until you get the evidence you would need to lean one way or the other. As far as we know right now, it is literally a he said, she said type of situation, as I said from the jump. This could go in a number of different directions. And so it was the right call from both sides, which in a court of law you don't always see. In some cases that I've heard about, you've had people ask for more evidence on one end, and then you'll have the opposition try their absolute hardest to deny the judge a chance to grant that motion. And again, that can be a coin toss too. But at least they were able to agree on that, because again, more information, more context is going to do everything to open this up completely and give us even more insight into truly what might have happened, what the extent of the relationship might have been, and so on and so forth in regards to this case between the woman and maybe other people that may have an involvement in this overall ordeal. So you take it from there, and the judge, J. Cedric Simpson, essentially set February 17th as the new date for a new hearing to, at that point have garnered a little more evidence, a little more documentation, and just, revisit a few different arguments. So they'd get in the court on February 17th. And oh boy, man, what would happen in there might have changed a lot about the tone of this case. At the very least, we're still in the early stages. It does give Sherrone Moore a chance to truly try, at least, to defend his name. Because, as multiple articles would state, multiple of them, quote from ESPN states, a judge on Tuesday granted a request for a hearing to learn more about an investigation that led to charges against former University of Michigan football coach Sherrone Moore, who was arrested soon after he was fired for a relationship with his executive assistant. It's a victory for Moore and lawyer Ellen Michaels, who is defending him against charges of felony home invasion, stalking, and illegal entry. They ultimately want the case dismissed. End quote. So, I mean, no matter what, the hearings were probably going to continue. But for them to come out and say that this is a legal victory for their side is definitely huge. Definitely. I mean, take all of what I've said over the entirety of this case about his reputation into consideration at this time. Just think about it from that standpoint. Even in that sense, people could still be giving him a cold shoulder and a mean side eye in regards to, again, the nature of some of these statements that have come out about this overall situation. And I genuinely, again, don't know to this point, even if in what would be a true surprise, if everything was dismissed, I don't know if everybody would just do a complete 180, although some will certainly do that. I can't say that everybody will completely change their tune about Sherrone Moore from what it may be for them at this point of time. But in the court of law, which ultimately, even if some cases can be amplified by, I guess, public opinion and exposure and things like that, the court of law is going to have the final say. And the court of law essentially said, hey, we don't have everything that we may need, but we do believe that you, in fact, have an avenue for a potential second chance here. So far, it is looking as if there is a slight discrepancy from what we previously have been handed over when it comes to evidence, when it comes to documentation, and when it comes to all the statements that we've acquired to this point of time. We found something within that does give you the right to keep this thing moving forward. And if you truly believe that you are innocent, that you are not guilty of any of these crimes, you now have another opportunity on the docket, at least, to prove yourself in a fair and honest way under the oath of the court. That's what they said, essentially. The reasoning for why this would happen is definitely major, though. It is not anything that you can push over. I just need to make sure that I find the entire quote here. Let me just see real quick. Because essentially, as the judge stated, to just say it from ESPN's perspective real quick before I find that quote. Quote, Judge J. Cedric Simpson expressed concern that a police detective didn't disclose Moore's employer-employee relationship with the woman, a glaring omission, when a magistrate authorized the warrant for his arrest. Defendant's due process may have been violated, Simpson said. This is not solely this personal relationship. The magistrate should have been able to look at that, said the judge, who set a March 2nd hearing to hear from police and other witnesses. End quote. Due process may have been violated. Whoa. We aren't even talking about general laws here, just on that scale. You understand Miranda rights at this point. That's obviously something that's going to play a factor in this. But due process is something from multiple perspectives that is also outlined in both the 5th and 14th Amendments of the U.S. Constitution itself. And so we have gotten ourselves into a hell of a twist here, where you're not only looking at the state and I guess the jurisdiction that handled this getting themselves into potential hot water if they again find evidence that these due process rights have actually been violated. You are also dealing with a potential violation of the U.S. Constitution. Now again, this is not... To say that, it's like you could be stretching it because, that would come into play if you are taking this to the Supreme Court. And believe me, there would be a whole lot of other webs that would need to be uncovered for this to be elevated and taken to the Supreme Court. But I digress. It's still a very interesting situation to be in regards to the reputation of the very police department here. It's like that just that cannot happen. Cannot happen whatsoever. No matter what the hell a suspect is believed to be doing or believed to have done, that is something that you owe them at that point. Literally, within the Miranda rights, you're hearing that every single time. You have the right to due process. So why is it that a detective, and a single detective, mind you, just peep that language, a single one, didn't give the full context? Why would that be the case? Is there anything deeper to that? Is there a motive for the detective to do this? Was this a particular accident? That would be pretty innocent thinking. And even if it was, it's like, this is legitimately a serious matter you're covering. And you have a screw up like that in this moment? That just can't fly whatsoever. So again, I can't act as if they were completely violated. That would just be unfair. But the fact that he, at multiple times, the judge, expressed concern about it, tells you a lot about everything going on there. Okay, let me see if I can find an overall quote from this article. Yeah, Pittsfield Township would be the police department in question. Just trying to get that sorted out. Let me see. Okay. And with his concern, he would get, honestly, into his own belief about the matter. The judge in question, J. Cedric Simpson. The overall quote from the Detroit Free Press states this, and I'll just read everything here. Quote, "What worries me is the magistrate did not get that opportunity to hear more information," Simpson said. "And if the magistrate didn't get that opportunity, that means what the people got may not have been a validly sworn out complaint, and that the defendant's due process rights may have been violated. That's my problem, or my concern." While providing his decision, Simpson said it's important that any court have a complete picture of what law enforcement knows before deciding whether to issue charges. What is clear from this court's perspective is that an omission in certain contexts can be more damaging, more problematic, more troublesome than what might be an intentional misrepresentation, Simpson said. He later said he thought law enforcement left out or included these key details as part of an intentional misdirection to the court. He also repeatedly called the information police presented one-sided. These and other comments appeared to show Simpson has serious concerns with how prosecutors and police obtained the charges in this case. End quote. So just think about all that. Now, again, we've established that he does believe that due process rights may have been violated and that he has a strong concern about it. Again, you're being read these rights as you are being taken into custody. That is how it goes. And the Miranda rights are also something that stemmed from this idea of potential misinformation being spread out and attacking minorities in this case. That is where the name Miranda comes from. Just aggressively interrogating them and not even having substantial evidence from anything at all to just then summon them into custody and then potentially get them sentenced. That is the entire reason why it is a law in the first place. And so to again understand that, even unconsciously at this point, you will hear it everywhere, and still go out of your way. Again, just a single one. A single one. And at that point, I guess that's understandable, because again, my thinking is that, like, in a situation of that magnitude, allegedly, you're going to have an entire squad of people trying to make sure everything's secure and make sure that the potential suspect in this case is no longer a threat in the matter. Of course, only one person can make a statement at a time. But again, to be the person in that situation, handling that responsibility, and then not completely doing every single aspect of your job can throw everything off. And they would hope that it doesn't in their situation. But now it's a matter of, okay, we need even more material than we thought at this point. If you're not going to tell us the full story. Again, as I said, for them, initiating the first part of this case, it's going to be understandable if you don't have everything there. Or strategically, from a law standpoint. Again, not an expert, but in some cases, if you do have all your evidence lining up in a row, to kind of streamline the process and make it easier on everybody, you may not want to give away everything that you have in the first part of the case. It's just the beginning. You have to be able to set the stage in some of these cases. You can't give away all of your intel that early and try to give the opposition an early read on you as to how to counter it. You want to leave them in a situation where they have no way of defending whatever it is that you might have come up with whatsoever. Even if they seem to be prepared as much as possible, to have that ace and expound it accordingly can be huge in some of these cases. So, from that standpoint, one may be able to understand, if you have an ace in the hole, why you wouldn't want to use all your information. But this is not that whatsoever. We've been hearing from everywhere else that there was an employee-employer relationship from pretty much everything else that I've read online. Yet, the police department handling the arrest, ensuring that Sherrone Moore was there for a night and some change in jail on booking, how is it that they did not have any understanding of the context, the full context of the relationship? That is fucking crazy. And Simpson's right in what he follows up with as you get later into the quote. But we also understand what's at stake here. You saw all the headlines. Michigan football head coach Sherrone Moore, former Michigan football head coach Sherrone Moore, is involved in this, and that. And what is he going to do now? How does this look for him? How does this look for the university? All of that is about how you present yourself in the public eye. And to have people hear all of that about Sherrone Moore, to have that fall back on the university, is something that can, as he said, be more damaging, more problematic, more troublesome. This was literally the head coach of the football team at Michigan University. That title carries a lot of weight in that specific area. So, from Michael's standpoint as well, if she really does believe that they falsified information and misled people, that could be a line of reasoning. I don't really know how people could be discontent with what Sherrone Moore was doing there as a head coach, but I digress. And if there was something like that going on, well, they feel like, okay, let's dramatize this a little bit. Let's make sure that we keep him in the courts and that he has absolutely no chance whatsoever of reclaiming this spot again. What a terrible way to think. But that's what it comes down to when you deal with, like, this isn't wholly libel and slander, I should say. This isn't wholly that, but again, your reputation is being dragged through the mud with every single detail following another. And again, the tone of them. To have Simpson come out and say that he thought things were one-sided on the end of the information that the police provided to the court, it says a lot. We're just going to do everything in our power, from his standpoint, to attack and shame the name and title of the Michigan football head coach, because he's the one seemingly with all the power, with all the pull in the public eye. And in the context of the relationship, yes, he would have a lot of the power in that dynamic. That is why Michigan, if you take it back from what I mentioned beforehand. That is why the victim was still on staff at that time and didn't face any particular punishment when it came to not, coming out about this beforehand. In that standpoint, from how they view it, she was very much pressured not to from their eye. And again, until she broke things off, felt a little more secure in being able to take that information out, that's when everything happened from there. Still, we don't know a lot about this victim. And even the Detroit Free Press said that, hey, in cases where, victims of domestic violence are being talked about, unless they offer consent, they generally do not name names. Fair enough. But there's more to the story, generally speaking. And every major thing that you heard about that entire shakeup, everything was relating to Sherrone Moore. The deteriorating mental health, seemingly. The family situation with him having multiple kids with his wife while allegedly having this affair for multiple years. On top of the work relationship. The, again, seemingly deranged actions from him when he was fired from his job after being alerted by this victim's, admission to the university on the matter. It's all about him. Or at least a good number of things are about him. The major developments in this one. And I can't even deny that when I read through everything at first, making the other videos on this matter. That can't be denied whatsoever. With identification, more information could come out. And if this victim is really trying to keep a low profile, that's going to be tough. But again, the phone records, the Title IX documents, and just trying to get a general sense of her overall role in the situation is still going to be just as important to the conversation, if not more important, than whatever Sherrone Moore was doing on his front or not doing on his front. And they didn't include that, seemingly, as an intentional misdirection to the court. He states as being the case here. So again, like I said, it'd be innocent a little bit to think of it as a pure accident. No, he's seeing this as like, okay, you're just leaving out all this context, all this detail to try to make this seem further out of proportion than it may truly be. And you know what? I'm not going to buy that. He's got his rights to due process, and we've got just as much of a right as the court to see a fair share of overall information from both sides. If one isn't even going to provide us with much of anything to look into, how exactly are we supposed to continue moving forward with the case to the fullest extent? You're not giving us every bit of information that we would need. That is going to be important to the conversation and the flow of things. You would hope as well on the outside looking in that things aren't intentional here. Because it's like, dude, as I said beforehand, the timing of it, even when you look at a previous report that I read, as they stated at that time, the timing of it can seem a little bit suspicious. Now again, there's nothing you can do with what like a different random post is talking about him having a text with a certain woman during the halftime of the game. That's a different conversation. But all of this takes place after Michigan loses that game. It's just not something you want to give any fucking merit to. Because as I said then, as I stand on now, even though it can be as big of a rivalry game as any of them in the college landscape, it's just a fucking game. I want so hard to believe that there is no way, shape, or form that all this is simply just based off of somebody being salty because Sherrone Moore could not get them their 5th straight win against Ohio State. It's just preposterous. It is preposterous, man. It is a fucking game. Like, this just has to be much bigger than something like that, right? I am hoping so. I am genuinely hoping so. There's no shot. But again, these are the things that they have to take into consideration overall. So, with that, you see. Right. So, as this Detroit Free Press article states, quote, the new hearing is scheduled for 9 a.m. on March 2nd, and it is anticipated the Pittsfield Township detective who gave the comments leading to the charges in the woman's lawyer would appear and testify, potentially along with other officers. The hearing, called a Franks hearing, will in part examine testimony provided by a Pittsfield Township detective to a magistrate who ultimately approved charges against Moore. End quote. So, again, reputationally, that could still be up in the air at this point. You just genuinely do not know if that will ever be the same for some people. But with what Michaels believes to be the case, they could, in fact, with that alone, if you're having officers testify about this and the idea of having all of this get sent over to a magistrate in the first place prior to any approval of any charges at all, it could create a scenario where they do, in fact, get even closer to potentially backing out of this thing entirely, somewhat unscathed, legally. And that would be very interesting. They are consistent, to summarize here, getting into a couple of these other quotes. Michaels was arguing the same thing, and to her credit, hey, J. Cedric Simpson was echoing the same point. But one thing that she consistently said that I guess honestly could be a good point to, just reflect on before capping it off. Because as far as we know now, that is going to be the final update on this until March 2nd. So they best get all of their stuff together and ready to go on both sides this time. Genuinely, that's how it's got to be. But this quote right here that Michaels continued to bring up according to the Detroit Free Press and others, quote, "It's not stalking if the communication has a legitimate purpose," Michael said, end quote. It's not stalking if the communication has a legitimate purpose. I don't know. When you first hear it, it sounds a little crazy. I don't know if I can fully agree with that. Just from my thinking. It's like, no, not necessarily. Not necessarily. Because that legitimate purpose, honestly, that can mean different things to a general stalker. Like, we don't even have to be in the confines of this being a work relationship. The intents of some of these people out here can be so far-fetched and so far out there that you can't just come out and say something like that, because that legitimacy could truly have a different definition for pretty much anybody involved in a situation like this where they are trying to stalk somebody. Now again, we'd be, critical of saying that, okay, it's like you're just being creepy. But again, in their minds, no, they're doing exactly what they want to do. And that's the unfortunate part about a situation like that. But with Michael saying it in this context, again, it being a work relationship, he is still, even with the relationship being done, there were a couple of other texts that they found, I suppose, from a couple days after this or so. And while you still had a blend of the few talking about the relationship, the affair from Moore's End, there were others that were apparently not included talking about general work updates. I suppose still relating to, general operations for the football team in the transition from the regular season to preparing potentially for bowl play against Texas and things like that. So again, if that's true, then it does change up the mix just a little bit. It doesn't necessarily take away from every single thing that has been documented at this point. And I think, honestly, with what I read elsewhere, they're essentially saying that themselves. It doesn't mean that every single other piece of evidence that the courts have gotten to this point from the police is just outright false as a result of this. But again, it simply means that, okay, we need more from you. You are clearly not telling us the full story. And we have to have that in order to move forward and get a clearer diagnosis as to what is going on. That is all we're looking for. And so on March 2nd, the Franks hearing will do just that. Again, on my end, I'm going to continue to keep up with that information. And I definitely have to with some others as well. But as far as this goes, I'll do it for this one. Peace.